Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently. Don't
miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Tonight on Farage, a day of high drama. The Prime Minister finally does resign. It had to happen, but should he stay on in number 10 until the next leader and next Prime Minister is chosen? Could this be a big conflict, a new civil war within the Conservative Party next week? It's that we'll debate and talk about tonight with a range of guests, many of whom know Boris Johnson very, very well. But before all of that, let's get the news.
Thanks, Nigel. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has resigned as leader of the Conservative Party. Addressing the country outside number 10, he said he was deeply saddened, but it was clearly the will of his party. He also explained that he fought to remain because he felt it was his duty. The decision to step down follows 3 days of government revolt that's seen almost 60 MPs, including 5 cabinet ministers, quit. Boris Johnson says he'll continue to serve as Prime Minister until the party chooses his successor, which is expected to happen by October.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. I know that there will be many people who are relieved and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
Well, following that resignation speech, Boris Johnson tweeted his thanks to the British public, saying it was an immense privilege to serve as their Prime Minister. He also pledged to continue serving in their best interests until his successor is in place. Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock says the next Tory leader needs to attract broad support.
Next election is likely about 2 years from now. We need to deliver in that time, but then we've got to also be able to get the support that we need to form the administration after that.
That's Matt Hancock's view. Mayor of London Sadiq Khan instead says Boris Johnson should immediately step down.
The Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, should be the caretaker Prime Minister, whilst the Conservatives choose their next leader. Once he or she's been elected, there should be a general election, so the British public have the choice of a fresh start, and I'll be campaigning for a Labour government led by Keir Starmer.
A cabinet reshuffle has been underway to replace those who've either resigned or been sacked. Kit Malthouse has been appointed Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster, the most senior position after PM. James Cleverly is the new Education Secretary. Robert Buckland, new Welsh Secretary. Shailesh Vara is the new Northern Ireland Secretary, and Greg Clark has replaced Michael Gove as Levelling Up Secretary, saying he'll do his best to provide stability in government. Meanwhile, former Technologies Minister Chris Philp has said he'll return to government if required now that Boris Johnson has gone. And in breaking news just in, the Ministry of Justice has confirmed that Tracy Connolly, the mother of baby P, who died following months of abuse, has now been freed from jail. And we'll bring you more on this story as we have it. On TV, online and on DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now let's get back to Nigel Farage.
Good evening. Well, I've been predicting it for many, many months. I always thought it was going to happen. I thought it had to happen. I felt in so many ways that Boris Johnson was elected as a Conservative but governed as a Liberal. To many Conservative thinkers, his policies on economics and on social affairs were frankly unrecognisable. But in the end, it was the evasions, the cover-ups, the untruths, the lies, if you want to use that word, that did for him. And when the end came, as it always does in these cases, it came very, very quickly. By breakfast time this morning, the number of resignations of cabinet ministers, junior ministers, PPSs was up to 59. I mean, the whole thing was becoming farcical. It was almost sort of carry-on Prime Minister. So the inevitable did come. Boris Johnson gave that speech in Downing Street. He said he was sad, and yet in a very funny way, it almost looked in his demeanour that a weight had been lifted off him. There are some out there very critical of the fact that he didn't show any contrition whatsoever for what was said over lockdown and indeed over the Pincher case. Well, they maybe have a point. He also had a bit of a barb when he said it was a very eccentric thing to do to get rid of a Prime Minister who, despite months of sledging, was only a few pips behind in the polls. But he said the herd in Westminster had moved, and once it moves, it moves. The herd meaning they're all pretty stupid, really. But look, that was an important speech for Boris Johnson, and I'm not going to criticise him for it. He's actually been through a pretty tough 3 years, and we'll talk about that and examine that. But, and here's the point, he fully intends to stay in number 10 with a newly appointed cabinet, and he intends to be there until the Conservative leadership contest is over. Already, there are some speaking out. Lord Frost says he should go now, as he's lost the confidence of the party in Parliament. John Major wants him gone. Dominic Cummings says the guy's a maniac. Leave him in Downing Street for another 10 weeks and goodness knows what havoc he might wreak. And so I want to debate tonight with you, the audience, and with my guests, should he go now? My own feeling is no. My own feeling is don't kick a man when he's down. Yes, I've had very big policy disagreements with Boris Johnson, but I want to say this. His intervention in the referendum campaign, and it may have come relatively late for those of us who spent a quarter of a century fighting for it, but his involvement in that campaign was important. Equally, his winning that general election with that big majority in 2019 was crucial. Otherwise, I feared we were heading towards absolute chaos and a second referendum. I honestly don't believe he's going to do anything crazy and stupid in the next few weeks. And I'm told by friends inside the Conservative Party that when the 1922 committee meet next week, they will whittle down to a short list of 2, get it out to the members, so this can all be decided by the 3rd week in August. So my view is he should be allowed to see out the next few weeks until we get a new leader. My fear, and my fear is for the Conservative Party, is there are many that won't let this rest. And after all, I guess they did resign on the basis that he'd lost integrity, he'd lost trust. And you may well see, come next week, another bout of Tory Civil War style infighting. We will see. Joining me is GB News' political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, just a reflection. 2016, David Cameron goes to the podium, resigns as Prime Minister. 2019, Theresa May goes to the podium, resigns as Prime Minister, and now it happens again today. 3 Conservative Prime Ministers resigning in 6 years. Quite extraordinary.
Incredible. As someone pointed out today, we think it's Ted Heath who's potentially the last Prime Minister who went into Downing Street having won an election and left Downing Street having lost an election. Every other Prime Minister since has either gone in on the sly or been kind of resigned and booted out that way, not through popular opinion. The Conservative Party, quite incredibly, have gone through an incredibly tumultuous period. And I think what we need to step back today and think about is, last year, not even last year, earlier on this year, this was a sense that this Prime Minister had an 80-seat majority, the largest majority a Conservative government had had since the 1980s under Thatcher, that this was Johnson's decade. Not that he was going to be around for one term, he's going to be around for 2 terms. He obviously, slightly jokingly, talked about being around to the 2030s, and yet now it is all over. He is, in tenure terms, essentially in the categories of the Gordon Browns, the Theresa Mays, and the Callahans, the Jim Callahans. And that is a personal bitter blow to a man who, frankly, spent his entire life trying to get into this job.
This was what his whole life was aimed at.
Yeah.
And he said today, I'm leaving the greatest job in the world.
Indeed, and whatever you think about him, the worst thing about it is he's brought it about him. He's got no one else to blame but himself.
They've really been unforced errors, haven't they?
Yes. I mean, and it started with the Patterson affair, completely misjudged that. Then, what everyone thinks about Partygate, the way it was handled, the kind of obfuscation and not being honest about it, did enormous damage. And then it was the same typecast when it came to the Chris Pincher affair. So, this is a very, very difficult moment, clearly, for him. I tend to agree with you. I think there will be people within the party who want to see him go immediately, but we don't do interim prime ministers in Britain. We've never had an interim prime minister. It would make more sense.
So do you not think we're going to see more fratricide next week?
I think the calls for it will be there. But I think in the end, the middle ground will hold, which is, what we need to do is we're not going to go to October. Yeah, let's get the Prime Minister in by the end of August, but let's give the Prime Minister a couple of more months. He'll go on some foreign trips. He'll get to pursue whatever he does. And as long as he doesn't do anything silly, we will give him that time.
Darren, you put in a good shift in today. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to College Green to join Tom Harwood, our political correspondent. Tom, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So tell us, what has the mood been down on the Green this afternoon? Are they going to allow Boris Johnson to see out these last few weeks? Or do you feel there's still so much anger about the way he's behaved that we're going to have more infighting next week?
Do you know what? At the start of today, this was a question that was very much in the balance. There seemed to be a lot of momentum behind those MPs who felt that the way the Prime Minister had behaved over the last 3 days or so had almost disqualified him. That usual ritual of presiding over the ensuing contest. However, really, it does seem that that view has ebbed as the day has gone on. Perhaps seeing that resignation statement there, the reality of what is going forward, and of course the inevitable speculation about who is next to take the reins, perhaps the anger that certainly existed towards the Prime Minister has subsided somewhat. And it does seem like the majority view now, at least within the Conservative Party, clearly, is that the Prime Minister should be the one to stay in his place as this contest goes on, as long as this contest does not go on for too long.
No, and the 22 committee, of course, will talk about the timetable for this next week. And I think there are some, Kwasi Kwarteng in particular say we've got to get this done as quickly as we can. And Tom, more generally, without naming names, because it's way too early for that, what are Tory MPs looking for in terms of the buzz down there on College Green? What type of leader do they want next?
Do you know what? Every single member of Parliament I've spoken to here on the Green, but also there in the building, in the corridors of power, they've been talking about policy more than personality. And perhaps that's because it is so early in the game, or perhaps it's because they want to keep their cards close to their chest. But it is certainly the case, I think. It's without doubt that whoever becomes leader of the Tory party will be someone who's talking about a lower tax economy. I think think one of the main reasons, and it's been little discussed, but perhaps more important than whether it was a scandal to do with sexual impropriety or to do with a birthday cake in the cabinet room, perhaps more than both of those was the sense of malaise that this government wasn't using its majority to be particularly conservative, and particularly on economic policy, on GDP growth, on low taxes. Those were the issues that maybe swayed more Conservative MPs' minds. Just one other thing, though, that I've been picking up that people are talking about, it's some of the final acts of what Boris Johnson might do. Traditionally, we see resignation honours from Prime Ministers, and we'll remember back to Theresa May's resignation honours, some surprises, a lot of political allies, but also her husband. And there's a lot of speculation tonight if Boris Johnson might follow in the footsteps of Theresa May and perhaps give an honour to his wife.
Oh, goodness gracious me. Tom Harwood, thank you very much indeed. Well, interesting, isn't it? What Tom's saying is that what Conservative MPs on the Green today are looking for, they're looking for a leader that is actually Conservative. Goodness gracious me. Well, I'm joined now by Lord Jonathan Marland, Chairman of the Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council, and, of course, former trade envoy to Boris Johnson. You feel sad today, Jonathan?
Yes, I wasn't trade envoy for Boris Johnson, actually, Nigel. I was for David Cameron, in fact.
OK.
Yes, I mean, I think we both, in a way, would feel sad because you wanted to see Brexit done. I wanted to see Brexit done. And Boris obviously took us out of an impasse under the Theresa May government and started creating the activity we wanted to. It's not done yet. No. And there are things that we both want to improve it. But I think, you know, we're now into the unpredictable of who's going to be the next leader, and are they going to have the same views that some of us who voted Brexit want to achieve?
Brexit obviously is important. Finishing the job is important. Completing it's important. All of that I agree with. But, I mean, let's be honest. Boris Johnson is really much more of a metropolitan Liberal than he is a Conservative. Well, it's big state, high tax, couldn't give a damn about immigration levels reaching a record. Green policy, I wonder how much Mrs Johnson had to do with that, but where we refuse to produce our own energy that we need. We're happy to see manufacturing, heavy engineering jobs, steelwork jobs go abroad. I mean, isn't it time? Isn't this now, Jonathan, about the Conservative Party re-evaluating what it actually is?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And the conversation I had with Boris after the vote, immediately after, was, you know, you have got to lay out a vision of how you see Britain in a post-Brexit and post-COVID era. Particularly in terms of making Britain 10% at least more competitive than Europe and America in regulation and in tax. And I think he was going to do that, but he met an impasse with the Treasury and with Rishi Sunak, and it was becoming a battle. And that, in a sense, possibly was the start of the resignation process, which has ended up in this really awful tragedy, in a sense, of Caesarian proportions.
Sort of psychodrama, wasn't it, by last night, you know? I mean,
Julius Caesar has had it easy compared to this.
No, that's right.
But I remember Boris, when I went to see him after the vote, he said to me, "Are you the man in grey suit coming to tell me?" I said, "No, I'm not. I'm really here because we're friends, you know, and I'm a Tory loyalist, and I don't speak ill about any of our prime ministers openly." But he said to me, "Oh, this vote is nothing compared to what happened in Greek times, where there were votes every other week." So he's got a great sense of history, that.
Jonathan, just on a human level, how's he going to be feeling?
Well, obviously, he had ambition way beyond this very short period. He is devastated, clearly. He was amazingly upbeat today. I wouldn't have been so upbeat, but he was. And that is actually, you know, his personality is, as you know as well as I do, Nigel. He's incredibly energetic, very positive.
Upbeat, unapologetic. And that was Boris Johnson, I guess, all over.
And you're completely right, that's him. And that is the appeal of him. And if he hadn't been dogged by the awful COVID and the terrible times that we've been through.
Well, maybe if he told the truth a bit more, it might have been helpful.
Well, he could have.
When you're caught making a mistake or getting in trouble, if you put your hands up and say sorry, people generally forgive you.
Yes.
He couldn't do that, could he?
Well, he did, but not necessarily in the right order, if you know what I mean.
That's the old Eric Morecambe joke, isn't it, about playing the piano?
Exactly. Jonathan,
thank you very much indeed for coming along and sharing that with us. It's going to be a fascinating period. How quickly can the party move and get a new Prime Minister for us?
Well, it is very important because, we've got 2 weeks of Parliament left. The 22 committee have got to get their act together very quickly because they're going to have to vote for a new leader. Can they do it in 2 weeks? Are we going to be paralysed until September when Parliament regroups? Because obviously it's the MPs that vote for the next leader. They're almost certainly going to be 2 candidates. Out of about 40 who are going to apply. It makes the Grand National look like a small race. And then we'll have that sort of awful period where the candidates go round and try and persuade the membership.
The hustings, etc.
The hustings, which will go on throughout the summer. And it's really a terrible period. And when we look at all the real problems going on in the world, it's not good timing, and as I've said that on this programme
I know you have. Although, in a way, if it takes place during the early part of August, there couldn't be a better time.
Correct.
Of the year.
Correct.
We'll see what happens. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for
Nigel.
coming in. In a moment, we'll talk to some people who work directly with Boris Johnson as economic advisors and political advisors, and I'll wonder just how much damage did Carrie do to Boris Johnson? How much damage did Dominic Cummings do to the entire government?
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV. On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Well, I'm joined now by Gerard Lyons, who was Chief Economic Advisor to Boris Johnson in his second term as Mayor of London. You were an advisor also in his first term. Quite interesting, before we start talking about Boris, one of the things we just picked up from Tom Harwood, who spent the afternoon on College Green, in terms of what do Tory MPs want now.
Yes.
And they want a new leader, a new Prime Minister, who's for lower taxes, less emphasis perhaps on some of the green stuff and a bit more pro-growth. I mean, you helped train Boris in economics. What did you do to him? Because he wasn't very conservative, was he?
No. Since he's been Prime Minister, I think there have been some major achievements. He did get Brexit done, but Brexit is a process, and even though we've grown faster than Germany since 2016, there's many things that he could have done, and indeed the next Prime Minister still needs to do to realise the opportunities. He actually did very well on the vaccine rollout, and also he was the first Prime Minister, maybe for half a century, to really take regional economic policy seriously. The downside and the biggest challenge, in my view, has been that he didn't have an economic vision, and therefore the Prime Minister, Boris, didn't stand up to the orthodoxy of the Treasury. And the Treasury's orthodoxy is, I still think, one of the biggest challenges.
Are they that powerful, the Treasury? I mean, but when I'm just thinking this through. You're the Prime Minister. You've just been elected with an 80-seat majority. Do bureaucrats tell you what to think and what to do?
Harold Wilson, when he was Prime Minister in the late 60s, said that you can be in office but not in power. Power lies with the Treasury. In other countries, the two offices that are in the Treasury are split up. That is, the Treasury has a budgetary department and an economic department. But the budgetary department, balancing the books, always takes precedence over achieving economic growth. They don't actually balance the books that well. So I think the biggest challenge for the Prime Minister, or Boris, over the last few years has been his lack of economic vision. I think whoever succeeds him needs to really have a pro-business, pro-growth economic agenda, and that needs to be aimed at some quick wins to address the cost of living crisis. We have both an inflation problem and an economic slowdown that's about to hit us.
Stagflation.
Well, some would call it stagflation, but it is part of both of those. But the trouble about calling it stagflation is that often the policy response is to squeeze the economy. What we actually have to do is to have a tighter monetary policy to get inflation under control. And we need to have a fiscal policy aimed at boosting the economy, and that has to mean tax cuts, giving back some of the revenue that the Treasury, the government has got in through higher inflation. So there has to be
in fact, the tax take has been a lot higher, hasn't it, than they anticipated?
Hence, many people are now being pulled up into higher tax bands. So I think there is a lot that can be done. And indeed, were the Prime Minister not to have been kicked out this week, my impression was that he was finally trying to get on top of this, albeit 2.5 years too late.
But economics never Boris Johnson's strong suit.
That's right. Yes.
You worked very closely with him.
Yeah.
You obviously liked him when you did work with him. It's a pretty tough day for a guy like that.
That's right. Well, I went from being head of research at a global international bank to then working with him in his second term as Mayor of London. What I found was that he didn't take easily to economics, but we would have regular meetings and he would sit down, get out his book as if though he was a journalist and go through things. And some people said that he didn't do detail. I found quite the opposite. Maybe it's because of the environment in which we operated. For instance, one occasion I remember talking him through the banker's bonus cap, and at the end I said, "Do you get it?" And he said, I do. It's like when Emperor Diocletian decided to try and control the price of vegetables in Rome. But he was a very, very good guy to work with. He was very personable, had great following. On international trips, he really promoted not just London, but the UK. And there were some good stories from that as well.
Gerard, if you manage to get Boris Johnson to do detail, it's a very great shame you worked with him. I think over the course of the last 3 years, we might have been in a slightly better position. Final thought on all of this, but important thought on all of this. Do you think today's modern Conservative Party has the courage within it to go for the kind of economic policies that you're talking about? Because I'm thinking back to Thatcher's time, when she had the Treasury against her, the media against her. I mean, the academics against 364 economists wrote to the Times.
Yes.
To do the things that you're talking about is going to face real opposition. Do you think that this party has the heart to do those things?
Yes, I think it does, provided it has the right leader and provided actually realises it needs to be very much appealing not just to people who work around here, but very much out on the front foot across the country. It needs a credible economic vision. I would call it a three-arrowed approach: monetary, financial policy, credible fiscal policy, but the whole supply side agenda. And again, reiterating the earlier point, is about pro-business, pro-growth, and actually recognising that you need to actually have some quick wins for people to address the cost of living crisis. But
so 5% cut on VAT on people's fuel bills would be an easy, quick hit.
I think that taxes on fuel and energy should be reduced. I think corporation tax next spring should not be increased, and there should either be an income tax cut or an increase in the personal allowances. So it's possible, but it requires the leadership to actually be looking at these issues. And one clear thing from when Boris was Mayor of London, and I think this is evident in terms of how international people see him over at Ukraine, he very much focused on boosting Britain, realistic in many respects, but at the same time, instead of talking the country down, it was very much about positive about what needs to be done.
And that was one of the great things about Boris Johnson. The boosterism, the optimism, and he was good at that. Gerard, thank you for coming in, setting out a vision that the Conservative Party, I think, need to follow. And wow, what an achievement. I mean, this man, Lyons, got Boris Johnson to do detail. Well, I've never heard anybody else ever say that at any point in time. Now, some audience reaction from you when I asked this question, should Boris go now or be allowed to stay? Peter says, Dear Nigel, I can absolutely see no reason for Boris not to stay on as caretaker PM. Those who want him to go now are people who seem to be bitter and twisted. Do you mean Dominic Cummings? Why even while the media are debating it? Alan says, Nigel, we are so angry Boris has been forced out. We know he's flaky, but the way the MSM and the obnoxious Tory party, and you, meaning me, have been hounding him is outrageous. Very disappointed in you for going along with it. Well, Alan, I didn't go along with it. I've been saying this for 6 months. I've been saying this for a very, very long time. You know, I wanted Brexit to be a success. And just passing a piece of legislation to say we leave with Northern Ireland in a mess, with nothing done to help our fisheries, with border controls, genuine border controls not put in place, that wasn't anything like the Brexit that I campaigned for and 17 million people voted for. But I acknowledge how important he was in that 2016 to 2019 period. Adam says, it doesn't matter, but he's still there. Well, look, there's lots and lots of views on this, and there's going to be lots of passion on this. I just wonder, you know, I am saying we should not kick a man when he's down. He should be allowed to see his last few weeks out. Now, Alex Crowley was an advisor in Number 10, and of course, from way before that, you have been with Boris Johnson. You worked with him for over a decade.
It's an odd day today because I was there right at the very beginning when he was putting together his mayoral campaign in 2008 in the old county hall just down the river there.
Yes.
And here we are on the day that his main political journey has come to an end. I don't see any way back for him after this, obviously. So it's a very strange day. And look, those of us who have worked with him closely, and there are lots of us, we could always see the potential for something like this to happen. His weaknesses were obvious to everyone, including the public, by the way. But a lot of us tonight are thinking, what a missed opportunity. He has
an 80-seat majority.
80-seat majority. The ability to communicate way beyond Westminster. He had the potential to build a whole new political coalition and use it to make real changes in this country that are so desperately needed. And he wasn't able to do that, and that is a shame because this country is badly in need of change and fixing.
Alex, is perhaps the fundamental problem here that he doesn't really have a strong political philosophy, that he's in politics, it's a career, he was always ambitious to be someone, to reach the top of the tree, and it was more about him reaching the top of the tree than it was about achieving policy objectives and goals. And that when you're in Number 10, and Mrs. Thatcher used to say, in a crisis, back to first principles. Well, she had first principles. You could agree with them or disagree with them. But you know, I mean, perhaps I've been a bit sarcastic. Perhaps some of the audience don't like it. But I've been calling you a metropolitan liberal rather than conservative. I mean, what is he really politically?
Well, I think this is the problem. He did not have a guiding mission. He did not have an agenda. He had his fair share of slogans and phrases, yes, but he didn't have anything really substantial behind that. And the problem with that is, when the going gets tough, as it always does at that level of government, he did not have a core agenda to return to. He did not have something that his supporters could unite around. So when he talked during moments of crisis about, well, let's get on with the job, let's get on with governing, people would rightly say, well, get on with what?
Yeah,
that was the problem.
What's it really all about?
That was the problem. I'll give you one small example. 2 weeks before he took over as Prime Minister, I was in this so-called transition team that obviously failed to organise a transition for many reasons. And we all tried to sit him down for a meeting for him to tell us what are the priorities, because there's an awful lot that needs organising. We eventually had that meeting, and the meeting concluded with him saying, well, I want everything. And of course the problem with that, if everything's a priority, nothing is.
Yeah. The one thing that shocked me in those early days when you were there, the team was being put together to go into number 10, I was genuinely astonished to see Dominic Cummings going into number 10 and taking a senior position, because it had seemed to me in my interactions with him and looking back at the history, and David Cameron, you know, had warned about this guy. I mean, I'm not saying I always agree with David Cameron, but he'd warned about this guy. And it seemed to me to be just a gross error in judgment in getting Cummings in. Just how destructive do you think Cummings is? I mean, I'm looking at his Twitter feed today, it's vile. It's all negative. But how much damage did Cummings do him, do you think?
An awful lot, because he brought Cummings in because he panicked. He panicked because he didn't have a plan. He didn't know what to do.
Right.
So in that, and it's literally days before he took office, he panics. He calls Cummings, and Cummings, of course, brings his own team and his own agenda. Now, I will give him credit.
And is that when you left?
Yes, I mean, because that's when there were a team of advisors who were meant to go in, who then suddenly were not part of Cummings' team, and who therefore were no longer part of, you know, we were a different tribe, and some of us sort of stuck around for a bit. The point is, I'll give him credit for actually creating the focus and discipline to get us through that constitutional mess. Okay, he does deserve credit for that. But the problem, the longer term problem, was Boris was never going to accept the Vote Leave crew to essentially use him as a vessel. He was never going to accept that. That was always going to come to a head eventually. And when it did come to a head, there was no replacement for it, because all of the people previously loyal to him had been, you know, chopped by Cummings' crew.
You'd all been turfed out.
Exactly. and look, it's politics, it's life.
Yeah.
You know, fair enough. But it meant that he was never able to have a stable team around him that could have provided the discipline and focus that could compensate for the weaknesses.
Fascinating. Now that's really, really interesting. And a final thought, if I may. Mrs. Johnson. Because it seems to me that Mrs. Johnson arrives on the scene, and suddenly there are lots of multimillionaires from Richmond who are having great influence over government policy. We have a conference speech where we're told that 30% of our farmland will be given over to rewilding. We're going to build back beaver. We're pursuing net zero. We're not going to produce our own gas or oil or coal, which we could. We're going to import it all. And it kind of hit the British people that the cost of all of this to them, of new heat pumps and electric cars and all the rest of it, was frankly, you know, to the Richmond gang, absolutely not a problem. Was it Carrie that turned him into a Green?
I think she had some influence on him, but there was a broader problem, which is because he didn't have his own fixed agenda, he would take on the agendas of others. Sometimes it was Carrie, sometimes it was Dominic Cummings, sometimes it was, and so on and so forth. And so therefore that's why you have these kind of wild vacillations in policy, where one minute he's a red-blooded tax-cutting Tory, and the next minute he's net zero, spend what you like, raise as much, the highest tax burden in history. It's that lack of consistency because he didn't have a fixed agenda.
Yeah, it says so much. Alex Crowley, thank you. A really, genuinely fascinating insight into the man, and perhaps into those flaws that in the end did for him. Thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we'll talk to Neil Parish, an MP who was turfed out unceremoniously. We'll also talk to Professor Matthew Goodwin about what now for the Conservative Party. Where does it fit on the British political spectrum?
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio,
On digital, absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
we're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Well, joining me now is a man who's been through a very tough time recently. I know about these things. It's not easy. It's not nice when the press pack are after you, whatever you've done. It's Nigel Farage, the former Conservative Member of Parliament for Honiton and Tiverton and a former colleague of mine for 10 years in the European Parliament. Neil, I put it to you that when you did wrong, you were turfed out very, very quickly. What did you think when it took over 50 resignations for the Prime Minister to say that he would resign?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably in a slightly different league to the Prime Minister, Nigel, but I think it was probably the Whip's office that I was more concerned about, dare I say it, than the Prime Minister. But, you know, you've got to get over it. You make the right decision. You go cleanly, and I've got to get on with life. But I've still got the political blood in me. I like to sort of commentate on what's going on in the world. So it's great to be on your show this evening.
So, Neil, I mean, what we're talking about tonight is he's going as soon as the next, man or woman becomes Conservative leader and Prime Minister. Do you think he should be allowed to stay on in number 10 during that period of time, or do you think he should go immediately and perhaps Dominic Raab or somebody else step up as an interim Prime Minister?
Well, what he can't do is stay there until October and pretend, it's life as usual. So, I mean, I think there's probably a compromise to be had. Stay for a while, but then go. I mean, I suspect the party, hopefully, is going to get its act together, get the candidates out there, parade them, get the parliamentarians decide who they want to put to the party and get on with it. We don't need to take until October to get a new leader in place. The problem that Boris has got too is how on earth are the world leaders and everybody else and everybody in this country going to really take you seriously when you are going? You either stay, as you know, Nigel, in politics, or you go. His resignation speech was interesting, wasn't it, today? Because it was quite difficult to work out whether he'd resigned or not, really. And I think he has got to face up to the fact that he's lost. He's lost confidence in the party. I actually have a lot of time for Boris, but the trouble is he was quite good on the big picture, but he became a sort of stranger to the truth in the end. And of course, that's what got him. And it was no good for him keeping on. Well, I do the big jobs well. I've said this before on many things lately. I think it was 6 times I saw him bounce into into Committee Room 14, the House of Commons, saying, I will do better, and it's all the culture of number 10. Well, of course, the trouble is, it was the culture of Boris in the end. And so we, as the Conservative Party...
absolutely.
The cost of living crisis and everything else.
And what did you make, Neil, final thought, please, what did you make of the sacking of Michael Gove?
Well, you see, I worked with Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for DEFRA, and I rate Michael Gove. He can be an interesting character, but you see, I sent Michael a message when Boris sacked him and said, well, now he's got a complete death wish. See, I always refer to Michael as the Duke of Buckingham. You know, he's got a series of troops there, and he will move them on or off the battlefield. And he is better on your side than off your side. And so, in political terms, but it was a shootout, wasn't it? At the OK Corral, it was who got their gun out first. Was Michael Gove going to resign, or was Boris going to fire him? And you could see this was a real final political drama, which I think probably was the very final straw for Boris.
Neil Parish, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight here on GB News. Thank you. 6 times, Neil Parish said, 6 times the Prime Minister goes into Committee Room 14 and says, I'm really sorry to the troops, I must do better. In the end, they gave up. Now, I am joined for Talking Pints, because I think we need it after this very long day, by Professor Matthew Goodwin, academic, political professor, commentator, cheers, TV star, and student, very much yourself, of centre-right politics in the United Kingdom. You're the second person this week I've had him that's written books about. We had Michael Crick in the other evening. And you wrote Revolt on the Right about UKIP and the rise of UKIP. I just... It's so interesting talking to Alex Crowley there a few minutes ago. You know, with Boris from 2007, all through 2 terms as mayor. You know, he goes through, becomes Foreign Secretary, Prime Minister. And Crowley says, you know, I mean, really what Alex was saying is that Boris never really believed in anything.
I think that certainly came through in his premiership. You know, I remember we first started talking about British politics 10 years ago, 2012. And, you know, at that point, we were starting to notice in British politics the emergence of a large number of voters that felt very unhappy with the Liberal consensus in Westminster, you know, that was basically pro-EU, pro-immigration, pro the political establishment in Westminster and London. And what happened over the last decade is that that group really grew, and they voted for UKIP, they voted for Brexit, and then they voted for Johnson. I think ultimately, though, Johnson really never connected with the people that put him into power. And I think in that respect, you know, Johnson is the beginning of a bigger problem for the Conservative Party, because whoever succeeds Johnson now, I think, has this really difficult balancing act. They've got to somehow hold those voters in the north, in the Red Wall, in Yorkshire, the Midlands, coastal towns, small towns, and hold the southern shires, middle class, graduate, prosperous. And those 2 groups of voters are very different, as you will know from your campaigning days. And I just don't see anybody at the moment who I think can pull that off.
Did Johnson take the party down the path of being a social democrat party more than a Conservative party?
Well, somebody wrote this week that one of the ironies of Brexit is that it actually ended up giving us a European model of the economy. It gave us a big state, higher taxes, etc. And I see some truth to that. I think the problem with Johnson, as your previous guest alluded to, you know, Johnson, I don't think really knows who he is ideologically. I think he's all over the shop. He's, you know, here 1 minute, he's there another. And I don't think that, you know, Johnsonism didn't really exist. It was the man with a few 3-word slogans, and that was it. Whoever follows him now has to come in with a serious blueprint for, you know, how they're going to fix Britain. And I can't think of anybody, maybe Margaret Thatcher is the exception, who's coming into power with an in-tray that is this daunting. You know, inflation, productivity crisis, low growth, Ukraine, you know, list goes on and on and on. And they're going to have an ideological blueprint for that. They're going to have a coherent, intellectually sound vision. Thatcher surrounded herself with very clever people. Even Blair got a lot of things wrong, some things right, but surrounded himself with some pretty clever people. Johnson, there was nobody really there. There was nobody in Team Johnson that was sort of, that got it, that had a bigger vision for the country. So whoever follows him...
Did Cummings have a little bit of that in terms of wanting to reform the civil service, etc.?
I think Cummings had a few ideas around, you know, trying to sort of build a technocracy, trying to sort of reform the civil service, but it wasn't very profound. It isn't very profound. I don't think he's sort of in tune with the kind of the realignment that is going on in British politics at the moment. And in a way, I don't think this saga has ended. I think this is just the end of a chapter. And I think what is coming in British politics even now, I still think neither left nor right are fully in tune with a large chunk of the country. And if you look at the last 10 years, Nigel, all the evidence shows levels of volatility, the number of people who are switching their vote from Labour to Conservative, Conservative to Lib Dem, Labour to Green, has never been higher. We've got about 60% of people in the last decade that changed their vote. So we're not going to go back into sort of nice, two-party Labour Conservative politics. If anything, I think we're going to just continue to see this remarkable churn that we've seen over the last couple of days and the last decade. Yeah. Lots of turbulence, lots of turmoil. And I don't know for certain where it's going to end up, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up with new parties, new alignments, new geographies.
That would happen if we got a change to electoral law. Because under the first-past-the-post system, it's very, very difficult for new entrants. Difficult to raise money because their donors finish up being given bills for inheritance tax. It seems almost incredible, but it's exactly what happened to many people who gave me money. Difficult to overcome the postal vote, where the Labour Party and Tory Party have already huge numbers signed up. They can turn those votes out. It's not easy. But what I detect is something quite interesting. See, I think Brexit was about a lot more than just leaving the European Union.
Absolutely.
It was about, we don't want London controlling everything in our lives, that narrow clique, and we've touched on that earlier on. But actually Brexit, and it was really interesting, when we formed the Brexit Party, and in 6 weeks won those elections in dramatic style, our slogan was change politics for good. A feeling that Brexit could be a fresh opportunity, a brand new start. I don't think the Tory Party ever understood that. And yet I detect, and you may think I'm wrong, I detect a growing appetite for proportional representation in some form, an appetite for electoral reform. I'm beginning to see it, and interesting, isn't it? Even people like Lord Mandelson saying we've got to start talking about this. Andy Burnham pretty much now advocating for it. The Lib Dems have always believed in it, and yet when Clegg had the opportunity, he went for a system that wasn't proportional, was preferential and couldn't be explained in a sentence, which is why Facebook shares are doing so badly now, is there. But do you think that big change is coming, or will it be resisted to the hilt?
I agree with you. That's why I mentioned the prospect of new parties, because I think on both the left and the right, I think there is a growing consensus that first past the post is not going to be sustainable over the longer term. I think if you talk to Lib Dems, if you talk to Labour activists, you talk to Greens, you talk to disillusioned progressives, all of whom are sort of saying actually this system is not really working out. If we do go to some form of proportional representation, obviously that is a complete game changer. I think also generationally, actually, there's a really important point. I think if I talk to my students about electoral reform, they're Generation Z, they're born after 1996. They look at first past the post as a sort of old-fashioned system that isn't in touch with their values. And I think as Gen Z and the millennials continue to go through the system, and a lot of decisions have gone against those generations. They weren't happy with Brexit, they weren't happy with Boris Johnson. I wonder actually if this question of political reform is going to become much more prominent going forward.
I sense it is. Interestingly, the Burnhams of this world think if you have PR, there'll be a permanent anti-Tory, anti-Conservative coalition. What, of course, they're not factoring is there would be a new UKIP-style party on the centre-right of British politics that would get millions of votes. That's my view.
Well, I think also the Labour Party would essentially break into two different parties. You'd have a radical left Corbyn-type party. You'd have a sort of, third-way type party. The Conservatives would almost certainly break into two. You'd have your sort of One Nation Liberal Conservatives, and then you'd have your sort of UKIP Brexit Party-type Conservatives. And I think, maybe that would be a healthier place for the country. Clearly, we're now coming up 6 years after Brexit. We are still divided. We're still arguing. We still haven't managed to get into a place where, we all feel sort of good about the country. We're ready to kind of embrace this new future. And whoever replaces Johnson, this again, I think is key. They're going to have to come into office with a serious plan here for bringing the country together and actually making the most out of the 2020s and the 2030s. They're going to have to think about what's the long-term economic strategy.
It's a big ask, isn't it? It's a big ask.
Can you think of another point in British history where somebody has had a bigger in-tray than Boris Johnson?
I think the in-tray in 1979 was pretty big. I think it was. I think the the catastrophes of the 1970s, the economic, particularly economic catastrophes, the downgrading of the status of the UK to almost nothing, a sort of sick man of Europe, as it was called. So I think the in-trade was pretty big in those days. I think the difference is, and OK, we did have the Falklands War, but the difference is we have China, and goodness knows what kind of threat that may pose to us, ongoing war in Ukraine. I think in foreign policy terms, this is quite a tough place to be. I think domestically, tax-wise, no, I think we have been here before, but I think to turn it around is going to be very, very difficult. What I've got you here, Matthew, America, thoughts on America? I mean, Biden won that election by very, very narrow majority. We've got the midterms coming up.
Yep.
Are we going to see the Republicans racing back?
Biden's approval rating just slumped to 36%, the lowest on record. About 88% of Americans are saying the country's heading in the wrong direction. Those are two pretty good indicators for midterm performance. I think the midterms are going to be very, very damaging for the Democrats. I think the Republicans are going to have a very good set of elections. And I think already you can see the key players positioning. My recommendation: keep all eyes on Ron DeSantis in Florida. I think Ron DeSantis is a very interesting politician, somebody who I think in policy terms is much more interesting than Donald Trump. Is he going to go for it, or is he going to be satisfied with becoming Trump's running mate? Who knows? Also, watch some of the remarkable shifts in American politics. Hispanic Latino voters abandoning the Democrats for the Republicans. That is something we haven't seen before. Keep your eyes on that as well. And we've got inflation, economic crisis. That is never good for the.
And Trump is still Trump.
Trump is Trump. He's also still very unpopular in the wider country. About 60% of people say they don't want Trump to run again. About 60% say they don't want Biden to run again. If anything, actually, American politics to me...
Is it a worse state than ours is?
It looks ripe for an alternative. It looks really ripe for an alternative.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Talking Pints on this really... Once again, historic day. Hard to believe, isn't it? 3 Prime Ministerial resignations on that lectern outside number 10. 3 in 6 years. It's difficult to believe. Been a heck of a day. I have to say, I've seen this coming for the last 6 months. I know many of you haven't thanked me for it, but it was obvious to me. And I think talking to people tonight who know Johnson so well, you can see the good parts of him, but in the end, the bad side brought him down. I've only had 1 day off this job, missed 1 show since the 27th of December. I'm off next week for a few days. I'll be with you the week after that. Meanwhile, I'll leave you in the capable hands of the GB News team, and right now, that of Mark Stein.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast. Staying dry for most of us over the next few days, plenty of sunshine, particularly across the south, and temperatures starting to rise as well. Taking a look at the pressure sequence, high pressure dominates our weather scene. It does sit to the southwest of us at the moment, meaning northwesterly winds just making a little bit cooler across the north and the west. But into the weekend, that high pressure moves in and temperatures start to rise. Through Thursday evening, plenty of clear skies across England and Wales. This continues overnight. However, parts of Northern Ireland, Scotland, it will cloud over. The risk of some patchy light rain and drizzle largely across the west and over the hills. And temperature-wise, double figures for all, so quite a mild night to come. Friday morning, best of the sunshine first thing across eastern England. Cloud across western parts of England into Wales will burn back towards the coasts. However, Northern Ireland and Scotland, it will be a cloudier picture here. A weak weather front slowly sinks south. The risk of a little bit of light rain and drizzle over the hills. Behind it, turning brighter across Scotland, but warm for everyone. The mid-20s across the Midlands and then perhaps the high 20s across southeast England, 28 or 29. So a fine end to Friday for many. This weak weather front, though, across parts of Northern Ireland and Northern England will just continue to sink a little bit further south, but dry for much of the UK. 1 or 2 showers across Scotland during the early hours, and overnight, once again, a mild night. Temperatures 12 to 15 Celsius as a low in the towns and cities, a little bit fresher in the countryside. So the weekend starts off dry and bright for many, a little bit of cloud across western areas, but this will dissolve as the day goes on. Plenty of blue skies for everyone. However, another weak weather front may move into the far northwest and Northern Ireland, western Scotland turning cloudy, but temperatures again reaching the mid to high 20s. This continues on Sunday as well, and then perhaps even warmer as we get to Monday with 31.
As the battle to bring down Boris succeeds, unceremoniously ousting the Prime Minister and plunging the Tories into chaos, political heavyweights and the most trusted analysts in the country will investigate the fallout of this unprecedented downfall and ask what on earth comes next. It's a Westminster in Crisis edition of Dan Wootton Tonight, with no spin, no bias and no censorship. Monday to Thursday 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. on GB News.